Hello everybody, welcome. I'm walking in the garden, as I often am. These days I'm not so fond of the box. Out here with my friends, the plants and animals, it's much better. It's open and alive. Breeze is dancing. The plants and animals are dancing and singing. It's very beautiful. Reassuring. Reminding me of the original light, from which all beings and places emerge in beauty together. And yes, I can see conflict and strife. I see suffering and disease and death. It really just depends on why I'm looking, what I see. And sometimes I don't feel so connected. Which is kind of a funny idea because really, one way of seeing is that we're inside a living womb together. And so the idea of being connected is kind of backwards. And I think many of our common thoughts and ideas and such are backwards. And it occurred to me, I was thinking, well, I guess first I should continue my original thought of, sometimes I don't feel connected. Which really means I'm not feeling my feelings. I'm not experiencing myself and my environment and our union in a fundamental way. I'm distracted by thoughts and ideas and names, and also by familiarity. If I think I know what something is, I've developed the habit of ignoring it. Right? We try to talk to a tree a few times, and when it doesn't talk back, we decide, there's nothing in there. It's empty. There's no being in there. How sad for us. It's just that the languages of the living beings aren't verbal. And so I think we have this idea of being connected, we have it backwards. It's not being connected, it's where we've disappeared from connection, where we've disappeared from communion, where we've defected from intimacy. The felt, deep, resonant music of intimacy. And we have lots of substitutes, much like with food or value itself, right? We have substitutes for actual value, which are objects and money and numbers and machines. So I don't always feel the deep communion that I sometimes remember. The living places help me. If I have lost my light inside, I go to them for it's in them that my light was born, and for them that my light was shining, and with them that my light made music. And it was always this way for me, since I was very little. I just naturally recognized the living beings as, how to say it? As fully complete, each in their own ways, and sizes and forms and activities and lives and dreaming and reproduction and death. Even the tiny creatures, ants and flies and earwigs and praying mantises and dragonflies, all of them, they seemed to me to be like people, just like people, but they don't talk the way people talk. They talk more like the way babies talk. And they all have different senses. But I was noticing something earlier that was quite profound. And I've noticed many similar things lately. And one of them, I had an exchange with some people. They were looking at a flowering tree that I know well and used to know the name of. And I've forgotten the name now. It has small purple, lavenderish purple flowers that look a little bit like orchids, and they were taking pictures of it and remarking on it. But they couldn't reach the tree physically because there were plants in the way. And I know this tree. And so I just walked over as they were talking, and I said, you know, I know you can't reach the tree, but it has a really incredible scent. They're like, really? I said, yes, it smells like grape candy. They're like, you're kidding. And I'm like, no, I don't know if you've ever tasted Pez candy, but it smells like grape Pez candy. And they got very excited about this and said, oh my God, I'd have never thought that. I'm so happy that you came over and talked to us about it. And there was like a wave of excitement that passed through all of us. Everybody got very excited for a moment. And I noticed I was feeling frisson. Frisson is like when you get goosebumps or all tingly in some kind of relational exchange or communion. And I was feeling the frisson, and it was very clear to me they were feeling frisson too. It just was like a wave of electricity that passed through all of us. And then I realized that when I watch animals, after they have some kind of a relational exchange, particularly birds, ducks, but dogs and cats and other creatures, dogs often do this. After some kind of relational exchange, they shake and fluff up. And then they may preen, right? They brush against themselves and preen and sort of comb their feathers. And even insects do this. Yeah? So it suddenly occurred to me that one of the languages of nature that we may have lost contact with is this frisson. This kind of transpersonal, trans-embodied transmission, like radio, right? Except with spirits instead of just waves of electricity and electromagnetic frequency, though certainly something resembling electromagnetism could be involved in our frisson, and it feels kind of electrical when I'm tingling inside. And often when I feel very joyful in some kind of relational exchange, I feel this frisson. I guess it's a French word. Frission or O-N, I'm not sure. And this is one of the old languages. It's one of the oldest, it's just a visceral thing. You can't, it has nothing to do with language, but language and communication can catalyze it, yeah? Can bring it forth in our experience. And I remember when I was younger, it was more common, but it still happens occasionally. I'll feel a kind of a jolt run up my spine from my tailbone. And there used to be particular experiences. For example, at least for me, it's not uncommon, or it used to be very common when I was younger, that if I was urinating, this might happen. I might get one of these little jolts. And there were other situations in which something similar happened, and of course there's the standing question of what orgasm is all about, what's actually going on there. Something quite fascinating and mysterious, believe me. Yes, it feels really good, but it's also strange. It's a bit like having an epileptic fit, right? One is completely overcome by these waves of pulsating energy, and for the males, being a male, I know what it's like to have male orgasms. And there are different kinds of orgasms, even for men. And there are non-sexual orgasms, there are relational orgasms. And some of them may be small, and we don't call them orgasms, but nonetheless, they're orgasmic. But yeah, I used to have these jolts, and sometimes I still feel them. And occasionally, if someone who I loved very dearly was suddenly injured, and I moved my mind in a certain way with the great, passionate desire for them to be healed and comforted, a strange energy would build up, and there would be little non-rhythmic pulses of jolting, and I could direct it out through my fingertips into their body. And sometimes when I was doing this without telling someone, they would ask me, because I would never tell them this is what I'm doing. It was just a natural feeling of care and concern and wanting them to feel better if they'd been hurt or injured, or if they were sick. And sometimes they would turn to me and say, "What did you just do?" And I would say, well, I would say different things, I think, in different circumstances, but I would say something like, I just felt the energy of loving you and wanting you to feel better. And they said, I felt it in my body. I felt it. And these kinds of things are lost, or they're counterfeited. Yet they're still accessible to us. And mostly, sage nectar. Mostly, our contexts deaden our senses, inhibit them, buffer them, counterfeit them, and so on. And of course, if we make up elaborate stories about this kind of thing, then we get, cults of woo, so to speak. And I'm not a fan of those. They seem like shadows where there could otherwise be light. And so you'll probably never find me trying to teach you some theory. Though I like to play with toys, perspectival toys. I think I tend to avoid beliefs, though I have something that resembles them. It's just they're not quite so structured or concrete. But all of the faculties that we're born with the potentials for, and there are thousands of them, not 5 or 6 or 10 or 20, thousands. And there are forms of sensing so astonishing that were we suddenly to feel them personally, it would seem like we were in a science fiction story or a magical situation, because they are completely unlike what we think, and they are completely unlike our theories. They have nothing to do with models and language. Though perhaps long, long ago, language was born from the verbalization, from the vocalization of felt sensing. And its musics were shaped by felt sensing. And so rather than it's conceivable anyway that in ancient times, 10, 20,000, 50,000, maybe 200,000 years ago, language was more like a jolt, right? It wasn't a choice. It was like when it was like when we put something so exquisite in our mouths that we just we used to make num noises, right? And then that stopped. And then we said, oh, it tastes good. But that's not the same as right? And I think that long ago, before language became so mired in its own structural surface, right? The superficial structure. I think it was exclamatory, right? The earliest forms of language were not something we intended to produce so much as something drawn out from us in a moment of incredible sensation and feeling, and perhaps recognition and remembrance. So I was thinking about a long conversation I had yesterday with a friend in the garden. And he was telling me many of the troubles, the things that trouble his mind and heart, which is a great honor. It's a privilege. To share in this way. And many of his troubles and concerns were very familiar to me. In many parts of our long discussion, as he raised something that troubled him, it was like hearing my own mind and my heart, but a lot of my mind, speaking to me from another male human. So I could deeply relate with most of his concerns, even though he's kind of very much in his head. And many of his concerns, like my own, they had to do with maps, trying to make sense of conflicting imperatives and ideas imposed on us from without, imposed on us from culture and, all the weird sort of scripting that goes on about what we're supposed to be and supposed to look like and supposed to feel, supposed to think, supposed to do. A bunch of supposed tos. And his desire to just be outside of that. It's ironic how close what he's seeking really is. It's closer to him than his own hand, and this is perhaps why it's so difficult to grasp it. Why gurus and teachers and elders and wise women, they often have a strange kind of smile on their face when we are sharing with them our narratives, our stories, our descriptions, our explanations, our questions. And they have this strange smile because they can actively sense. They know it consciously too, but they can actively sense that we're passionately walking into a series of traps that we're composing with each move. And we want them to come with us into our trap and to tell us how we can get out of our trap. But they can see that we're forming the trap we're trying to get out of with our thinking, with that structured surface of the mind. And most of that stuff is meaningless. It's not that it isn't meaningful in our experience. Of course it is meaningful. It affects our experience. It affects my life. I have troubles and fears and vulnerabilities and concerns, and if I focus my mind in that way, they immediately become extremely compelling. So compelling that I become insensate. My sensing stops, right? It's as if I've disappeared into the construct of my trouble in my thoughts. And the older wise people, many of them, they know about this. And we're doing it right in front of them, and they just kind of smile. And their eyes glisten and sparkle. But most of us are so busy with our traps made of maps that we're unavailable. Much as my friend was yesterday. To the fact that in this moment, we are free. When we are together, in harmony, we are free. So I was thinking that all of us, part of our experience in modern culture and in our personal human situations, which are actually really bizarre and conflicted and unjust, like just wrong, right? It's fundamentally wrong. And we know about what's going on in the world in a way that our ancestors never did. And there are all these felt senses and imperatives. We have to do something. They're torturing children. They're torturing elderly people. They're torturing adults. They're tearing apart the ecosystems. There's all this news and noise and advertising and products and objects and cars and machines, computers. The boxed up rectangles within rectangles within rectangles within rectangles of our homes. Right? Look around you in your home, or even where you are right now if you're not in a natural place, or even if you are in a natural place. Here, where I am, there are many rectangles. Everywhere the humans have made something, there's a rectangle. The trellis, a rectangle, with squares all through it. Right. And of course, sometimes the humans make round things too. But we have this problem with structure, and particularly angles in structure. Right? Our structures are angular, and nature is round, mostly. So I was thinking, we're making maps all the time to try to understand. Maps are shortcuts through terrain, right? Maps represent the possibility of being able to navigate using a simple set of instructions rather than having to be intimately aware of where we are and our footfalls and our paths and routes. Hey.
Does he he's at home all the time?
And our questions are mappy. And almost all the concerns my friend presented were mappy. They were mapping conflicts. Well, they tell me to be a man and get a job, but I don't want to work for the destruction of the planet. And what is a job? And why will I have to do all these strange things that have nothing to do with my life or being? And, I feel that if I'm not productive and wealthy, then I'm emasculated, or I'm failing somehow. And this kind of thing. And the conflict, another thing he mentioned was the conflict between being trained as a child and scripted, a moment. One of the things he said was they trained me how to speak language, and they trained me how to do tasks, and they trained me how to do math. But they didn't teach me how to be a being. Right? And this is a really important truth. Something deeply true here. They didn't teach us the things that truly matter about being alive. They were teaching us how to navigate in the structured miasma of human culture, commerce, banking, taxes, consuming. And he really had a deep pain around this, and I can understand that. I was very lucky. I was born with some of that knowledge intact somehow within me. And so I sort of underwent the opposite process, where the innate understanding over time was buried by layers of habit and distraction and fear and concern and conflict. Because all of these structured imperatives, many of them conflict with each other. So we can't simultaneously entertain the idea that we're supposed to be a good, productive worker, citizen, so to speak. Really what that means is slave. And at the same time, we're supposed to pursue awakening. And we have the same problem with all of these things where, there's a bunch of counterfeits already on the shelf advertising to us about their glories and ecstasies and liberations, when really it's just more junk. There was an actress who, though I don't usually read news articles, something drew me to this one. She had discovered that she had cancer, and she was engaged in making some popular shows. She was a voice actress in one and a central actress in another. When the pandemic hit, and I think during the pandemic, or maybe just before it, she may have discovered, at some point she discovered she had cancer, and probably would not live a whole lot longer in this body. And so her and her husband devoted themselves to what we call philanthropic activity, or altruistic activity, right? And they had to invent whole ways of helping people because there was no existing things like that. And they worked night and day, and they got no sleep, and they were completely committed to this path of doing something truly meaningful, now that it was clear and obvious that her death would come soon. And she said something like, this is ironically resonant for me, she said something like, I remember back then when the pandemic first hit and we were trying to understand how we would continue to make the shows. And now, all of that, I just recognize it as so meaningless. And this is one of the great powers of the fact of death. It has the power to cast a sort of black light, a kind of ultraviolet light in a way, that makes certain things stand out that are otherwise invisible to us. And it can tear the wrapper off the charades in which we are so commonly engaged, so that we see the living sort of flesh of meaningful activity and relation, and then we easily know what direction to go in. My friend, he asked me what I thought about divine matters, life after death, is there a God? What about suicide? And I spoke with him and said, these things are deeply mysterious. I can say things about what I have gleaned about them in my life. They may not be the same for you. But I said, the suicide idea is an exit option, right? The mapping and the conflicts and the lying and the counterfeiting, co-opting, commodification, objectifications, all these things, which are really mostly public things, right? These are things that intrude on us from outside ourselves, right? You could think of them as bad transfers. Some of them are useful and workable, but when the structured fictions dominate our thoughts and our awareness and our consciousness, then we are truly suffering. Yeah. Even if we are entirely healthy, we are still suffering. And isolation worsens this and intensifies all these problems. But I said, death will take care of itself. There's plenty of time for you to be dead. While you are alive, be alive. And resist the urge that leads in the direction of resignation, right? Because there's different kinds of resignation, in a way. And suicide is one of them. But addiction is a more common one, right? It's like the slow version of suicide. We don't know what to do, we're alone, we are bored, we are confused, we are frightened. And the drugs or the behaviors somehow they emulate what we are missing or some partial piece of it. And then we become addicted to the rhythm of going after that poisonous nectar and the intoxication or the immediacy of pain, like for people who are cutting, or vomiting for people who are bulimic or anorexic, not eating. Fasting produces a kind of intoxication. And so all of these addictions, shopping and television and movies and computers and buying things and clothing, style and fashion and so on, they replace something we might feel as a void inside our lives and hearts. And there's a little bit of relief in there. But it's the wrong kind. Most of us quickly become dependent on it. And so we're actually going in the wrong direction. We've got it backwards again. And it's painful to be addicted because our soul senses the compromises. And there's something older than mere conscience in us that knows that we're in danger. And so we become torn inside against ourselves, in our hearts, in our minds, in our finances, in our relationships. Because addictions easily acquire extreme priority, right? Whatever I have to do today, it's only half as important as that I get that pack of cigarettes, right? Those beers, whatever the substance or behavior is, it just becomes fundamentally important. And I think we're hitchhiking on a sinking ship, right? And part of us wants the ship to actually just finish sinking and be done with it. But another aspect clings to life. And we have, as part of our, interiority, an aspect sometimes referred to as the Thanatos Urge, which is the urge of self-extinguishing. And I think it's unfortunate that more people don't understand that that's a natural aspect of our interiority. But its goal isn't to kill the body, which might be understood as a vehicle for something primordial, to undergo a kind of educare, right? Educare, which is the root word from which education is derived. But it's a learning vehicle, the body, for something really profound that doesn't fit in language, but something we are all intimately familiar with. In fact, our felt sense of familiarity emerges from this primordial original light, that our bodies and lives are expressions of the character of. But there's a safer and available exit path that is beautiful and trustworthy. And it's the path not of killing the body, not of suicide, but of extinguishing the personal identity. Right? And I don't really like the word killing here, even though it might be appropriate. But this is what the Thanatos Urge, I think, is actually oriented around. Though it has some natural connection with, or union with, physical death. But we can easily imagine sort of physical death, right? Taking my own life. I can imagine it. It's much more difficult to imagine taking away my personal identity and all of the maps and fucking, topographies and ideas and thoughts and assertions and declarations and arguments and so on. And I wish I'd been awake enough yesterday with my friend to express this. But it took me a while. I had to stew on it for a moment. Let it simmer, which is a phrase I think he used himself. Yeah, I mean, the idea of suicide is woefully overwrought when what we're really after is the liberation from the cage of personal identity. And it's a lifelong process for most of us, those of us who embark upon it. It's commonly understood in meditation traditions and some religious traditions that the personal identity is a convenience that may serve us for a time, right? We wouldn't want to try to necessarily teach people who have not developed an ego yet much to get rid of it, right? They might need to actually develop it and have all that structured confusion and conflict, and because that's part of our educare as humans. But once we've had a good taste, it's probably enough, right? We don't need to keep carrying on in that way. And liberty of a kind so shocking and ecstatic that no description will ever encompass it, and science will never come close to it. The great liberation of releasing personal identity becomes plausible at first. And each of us may become involved in this path in our own unique way. I know, from our own unique history and with our own unique vulnerabilities and gifts. That's entirely natural. And this is why each person's path in mindfulness is at once generally similar to that of others and entirely unique to them as an embodied soul, I might say. And frankly, it's really astonishing to be embodied. As humans, we have liberties extremely uncommon among plants and animals. Think of a tree or a plant. There's some loud sirens one moment. The tree or the plant will live its entire life in one physical spot. Yes, that spot will transform and humans may come and destroy it, or other things may happen, earthquakes, fires. The trees cannot run away from the fire. The plants cannot run away from the fire. Right? Wherever they happen to be born is where they will grow and live for their entire lifetime. Think about that for a moment. Think about if you could not move at all, right? Not only could you not move your limbs, you can grow them, you can infoliage them, right? And grow leaves and flowers, but you cannot move. It doesn't matter what comes, because you can't do anything about it at all, physically. You might be able to do something relationally. Maybe. There have been situations where an animal touched the hunter's mind. The hunter decided, I'll not kill that one. Or the tree touched the woodcutter's mind, and the woodcutter thought, I'll not kill that one. But they are trapped in our language. And yet, because they have no liberties of movement, they have other liberties of relation. And this is very important to understand. Because we can be similar. We are similar in many ways. But we have incredible liberties. I mean, most animals, very few of them can caress another living being. Most of them don't have hands. Some of them do. But many of those that do have claws, right, they're not really designed for caressing, and humans can love. We have a great luxury of freedom in our daily lives, even if our daily lives are profoundly impinged upon by work or slavery or suffering. We have all kinds of astonishing liberties. We don't have to concern ourselves at every moment with predators and danger and food and nesting. We can devote a small amount of our attention there, and then we have the strange problem of the luxury of being human. And the irony of that luxury, for we are at once endowed with incredibly impossible faculties and abilities, and at the same time there's no context to enact their beauty and profundity. Or at least the dominant contexts inhibit it, counterfeit it, overwhelm it, dominate it, so on. So that even when we have what we call free time, we may feel no spark of inspiration inside us. Yeah. And so we may be bored or seek to distract ourselves or engage in addictions and so on. But when I began the recording, I was thinking about the peculiar situation of our waking mind world, our culture world, the public aspects of our life, humanity, and how most of us are trying to make maps, right? We want to know what things are and how they work and what we're supposed to do and what we should do. And what's the right thing to do, and what's the best thing to do, and what's the wrong thing to do, and what do we not want, what do we want, and so on. All this mapping behavior. And again, I wouldn't want to throw the whole thing away. But its dominance should be discarded, because that's a very tiny part of what it means to be human, and what it can mean to be human, what we can become as human beings. It's an essential part if we live in a structured society, much less so if we are hermits or live in the wilderness. Then we can evade all that noise and argument. Here's my friend. Pause for a moment. So it turned out that I saw my friend with whom I'd been speaking yesterday and was able to talk with him about some of the results of my stewing. And we had a nice walk in the garden. And it's good, yeah. But we make these maps, and this is what we're scripted to do in childhood. And they're very superficial maps. They do not capture deep meaning. They capture a kind of strange aspect of structure, or even an estranged aspect of structure. Estranged from what? Well, from our original light, from our interiority, from our nature as human beings. And they become layered in consciousness, and they compete for dominance, and they capture our threat sentinels and our opportunity sentinels. And by capture, I kind of mean take hostage, and then deploy them against our own well-being, insight, inspiration, intuition, the real intuition, not the goofy, phony stuff. Our real, our necessary concerns about threats and opportunities, those get overwhelmed too. And so we end up with something in our mind a bit like the broken society we live in. And in fact, it's fairly clear to me that our minds are projections, are partly projections of the often cruel or confused imperatives of the collectives and the institutions and the societies. I don't want us to stop making maps. I just want us to be aware when that process becomes so overwhelming and so confusing and so fraught that there's no more space for our sensitivity, for our actual intelligence, and for the faculties that we can develop instead to emerge into our awareness and experience and accessibility. Many of my close friends are what could be called deep thinkers. And some of them are extreme thinkers. And these people suffer most under the strange domination of the maps they've made over their history, some of which might have been important to get them through a crisis but could then have easily been discarded. And the boy's making a display. This is a different boy. I have a little bit of food left to share with him this evening. Iksakapi. It is good to share food. But there are many kinds of nourishment. And much of our true nature is invisible and starving in the battlefield of maps and ideas, concepts and words, language, shoulds and supposed tos. Again, some of that's okay, a little bit in the soup, not so bad. When most of the soup starts turning to maps and shoulds and shouldn'ts, now there's a real problem. That soup's no longer edible. Not only will it not sustain us, it's incredibly expensive to sustain. It's like the war machine, right? It eats up everything. It's like commerce. It eats up everything. Now there's no oxygen in the mind, no spaciousness. And we can become a bit like ghosts. I mean, I can, So these are my thoughts for this evening, the things that I've been rolling over in my awareness and talking through with my friend. And all of my friends in the garden, the beautiful silent ones that don't make words. They make incredibly nourishing modes of stillness. And that's refreshing and renewing, reassuring and inspiring. As I hope that my wanders sometimes are for those who listen. So thank you for joining me today. I look forward to learning again very soon. All blessings to you and those you love. Bye-bye for now.